The ground was stubborn, half sand, half clay, and my little folding shovel rang with every strike against it. The air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen, thick and metallic, as if the sky were waiting for permission to let loose. I'd hiked into this backcountry site earlier that afternoon, the kind that exists only as a faded dot on a topographic map. Established, they called it, but there hadn't been a footprint, human or animal, within 50 yards. I'd picked the spot beneath two tall ponderosas that framed a view of a distant ridge, their trunks dark and resinous from an earlier storm. I was digging a shallow fire pit, nothing fancy, just deep enough to cradle a few coals, when my shovel scraped against something solid, something that didn't sound like rock. It was a dull, almost wooden thunk, hollow and strange. I brushed away the dirt with my gloved hand and uncovered the corner of a small object, smooth and worn. Pulling it free, I found myself staring at a wooden bird, hand-carved about the size of my palm. Its wings were tucked in close, its head slightly tilted as though listening. The detail was remarkable. Every feather line cut with patience, even the tiny eyes inlaid with some kind of dark stone. But time had worked its way into every crevice. The wood was cracked, the varnish long gone, and one wingtip was chipped clean off. For a long while, I just turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, light, but significant somehow. It didn't belong to this landscape. No one carved birds out here anymore. There was something about it, though, that didn't feel like litter. It felt left, deliberately. That night, I set up camp beside the pit and built a modest fire. The bird sat beside me on a rock, its shadow flickering in the orange light. As the flames died down, the wind shifted through the pines, carrying the sound of distant water, a creek, maybe 100 yards off. I remember thinking I could hear something else beneath it, faint but rhythmic, like the echo of a hammer or a heartbeat. I slept fitfully. At some point I woke to find the fire nearly out and the moon filtered through the clouds. The little bird sat exactly where I'd left it, but there was something etched into its base that I hadn't noticed before. I brushed the soot away and found a set of initials, E.M.W, carved neatly in block letters. The next morning, curiosity gnawed at me more than hunger. I packed a small day bag, tucked the bird safely inside, and set out to follow the creek downstream. The land sloped gently into a hollow damp with moss and shaded by alder. I was half convinced I'd find nothing, maybe just a collapsed fire ring or a rotted log, but an hour later I came across a faint rectangle of stone, too perfect to be natural. Someone, long ago, had built a foundation here. And just beyond it, leaning against a tree trunk, was the rusted frame of an old camp chair, the kind that folded flat canvases. Long gone. Something told me E.M.W had once sat here, watching the same mountains, listening to the same wind. But why bury a bird? I didn't know yet, but I could feel the question rooting in me like the scent of pine smoke in a wool jacket, something that would linger long after I left these woods. By midday, the sun had burned through the thin cloud cover, turning the hollow into a damp oven of light and steam. I sat beside what was left of the old foundation, tracing the outline of stone with a stick. It must have been a cabin once. Small, no bigger than 10 by 12 feet, maybe a hunter's retreat or a ranger's outpost before the park boundaries were drawn. Lichens crawled over the rocks, and a birch sapling grew right through the centre. Whoever E.M.W was, their place had long since surrendered to time. I started to poke around, careful not to disturb more than I had to. I found the remnants of a rusted coffee tin, half buried in leaves, the heel of a leather boot and a bottle shattered into a dozen green shards. Then wedged between two stones in the old hearth, something caught the light. A thin scrap of paper, stiff and almost black with age. I pried it loose with my knife and unfolded it as gently as I could. Only a few words were still legible, faded pencil scrawls that trembled across the page. Third night. Storm took the roof. The bird watches. If anyone finds this, tell her I tried. The rest had been eaten away by moisture. The handwriting looked hurried but strong, the kind of script learned decades ago. I sat there staring at it, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. The bird. It had to be the same one I'd dug up. Whoever wrote this note had carved it or kept it close, for comfort, maybe for memory. Tell her I tried." I said the words aloud, and they hung there in the still air like smoke from a dying fire. The creek murmured nearby, a low whispering sound that seemed to rise and fall with my thoughts. I followed it a short distance until it widened into a pool, clear and shallow. I could see fish slipping through the light, darting over stones flecked with mica, and on the opposite bank, half sunken in the mud, I spotted a metal glint, a rectangle with edges too even to be natural. Wading across, I reached for it. It was a dog tag, the kind issued to soldiers. The chain had broken long ago, and the letters were nearly illegible beneath a crust of rust, but I could just make out E.M. Whitaker. I stood there, water swirling around my boots, staring at that name, Whitaker, E.M.W. So it wasn't just initials, it was a life, a person. Maybe this was their final camp, their secret place. Maybe they'd never left. The breeze shifted, and a faint scent of wet pine and smoke drifted past me, though my fire had been cold since morning. I looked back toward the hollow, at the lonely scatter of stones and the empty chair frame gleaming faintly in the sun. For the first time since arriving, I felt watched, not in a threatening way, but as if someone was waiting to see what I'd do next. I pocketed the tag, packed the bird, and turned uphill. There was more to find here. The forest had gone quiet, and each step forward felt less like exploration, more like stepping into someone else's unfinished story. By late afternoon, the light had turned that golden kind of soft that makes even the dead trees look alive. I followed the slope upward through a maze of pine roots and ferns, thinking I might find an old trail or perhaps a cairn that would lead me to whatever E.M. Whitaker had meant by "tell her I tried." My boots crunched over needles, the sound sharp in the quiet. Every now and then, I caught myself glancing down at the bird inside my pack, as if it might somehow offer directions. The woods grew older as I climbed, larger trunks, moss thicker underfoot, the ground springy and damp. I came across a log nearly swallowed by fungus, and beside it, a half-collapsed rockfire ring blackened by charcoal that had long gone cold. A second camp, or maybe the same one, expanded over time. I couldn't be sure, but near it, nailed crookedly to a tree, hung something unexpected. A small tin plate, the kind you'd eat from on long trips. Someone had etched words into the metal with a knife point. They were hard to read, but under the grime and oxidation, I made out, "For L, keep looking east." That was it. Just those 5 words. I stood there, staring at them, and the woods seemed to tighten around me. The silence wasn't unfriendly, but it was dense, full of things unsaid. East of here, the land fell away into a valley that I knew ran for miles before meeting a river. I set off in that direction, walking slow, careful. Every few hundred yards, I noticed small signs, stones stacked too high, a piece of blue thread caught on a branch, what looked like a faint notch in a trunk. They could have been random, but together they formed a trail of sorts. Each time I questioned if I was imagining it, another mark would appear. When I finally reached the valley floor, the air had cooled and mist was beginning to creep between the trees. There was a clearing there, barely the size of a small cabin, and in the middle stood a single wooden cross, old and grey, leaning slightly as if the ground beneath it had softened with age. No name, no date, just the same initials carved deep and deliberate. E.M.W. I knelt beside it, tracing the grooves with my thumb. The cross was rough-hewn from pine, weathered until it had the texture of bone. Around its base, the earth looked disturbed, as if something had once been buried there and then unearthed. The bird. I realised, with a small shiver, that the spot where I'd pitched my tent, the fire pit I'd dug, was almost exactly the kind of place someone might have chosen to hide a memento, when the grave itself had already been disturbed, maybe by time, maybe by flood, maybe by an animal. I sat there until the first stars appeared. The forest pulsed quietly around me, alive with the slow rhythm of dusk. I felt no fear, just a strange sense of continuity, as though my hands by accident had touched something still unfinished. When I rose to leave, I whispered into the mist, "I found it, E.M.W." And though the wind carried my words away, I could have sworn the pines murmured back, soft and low, "Keep looking east." The next morning dawned grey and heavy, fog pooled thick among the trees. I brewed a cup of coffee over a tiny fire and watched the steam twist upward until it vanished. The air carried that faint chill that hints at autumn's edge, though the calendar still swore it was summer. My thoughts were as restless as the smoke. The cross, the note, the name, E.M. Whitaker, they all turned over and over in my mind like stones in a current. I decided I couldn't just leave. Not yet. The inscription on the plate, "Keep looking east," felt like a command. So, after dousing the fire, I packed light. Only a jacket, a small ration of food, the bird, and the dog tag. I left my tent staked where it was, a marker to return to, though some part of me already suspected I wouldn't see it again before nightfall. East meant following the valley downstream. The forest changed as I walked, pines giving way to aspen and alder, their white trunks glowing like bones through the fog. The sound of water grew louder until the creek became a full-fledged river, wide and slow. On the opposite bank, the land rose sharply into granite ledges. It was there, halfway up the slope, that I noticed the faint square shape of what might have once been a cabin wall slumped under the weight of decades. It took nearly an hour to ford the river and climb the hill. Up close, the structure was little more than a skeleton. Half a wall, a chimney base, and a scatter of timbers blackened by fire. Charred, but not recent. I stood among the ruins, feeling the hush of old loss. When I brushed the soot from one of the beams, I saw it again. Those same initials, E.M.W, carved into the wood with a sure hand. Beneath them, smaller letters followed. LWL, the one from the tin plate. "For L, keep looking east." I started piecing it together. Maybe E.M.W had built this place for L. Maybe the storm in the note had destroyed it, forcing him to flee. Maybe "tell her I tried" was meant for L, whoever she was. A wife, a daughter, a sister, someone waiting. The floorboards were gone, but near what might have been the doorway, I found a shallow depression filled with damp leaves. As I cleared them away, I uncovered a tin box, rusted, but still intact. My hands trembled as I pried it open with my knife. Inside was a small folded photograph, the kind printed on thick paper from the mid-20th century. It showed a man in uniform standing beside a woman holding a carved wooden bird. They were both smiling, framed by pines that looked achingly familiar. On the back, written in the same strong handwriting as the diary scrap, were the words, "Lydia, our valley. If I don't return, you'll know where to find me." I sat there a long time, the forest holding its breath around me. The bird in my pack seemed heavier now, almost warm. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured, a reminder that weather, like memory, always circles back. The rain started not long after I found the photograph. Slow at first, then steady, drumming softly on the burned timbers and the brim of my hat. I stayed crouched under what was left of the cabin's roof beam, staring at the faces in that faded picture until the ink began to blur in the damp air. E.M. Whitaker, I assumed, and Lydia, the woman holding the carved bird, smiling in a way that said she believed he'd come back, but he hadn't. He'd buried the bird, left a note, and vanished into the folds of these mountains. By the time the rain eased, mist was crawling up from the river again, thick as breath. I walked back to the cross at the valley floor, my boots squelching in the wet earth. The wooden bird felt warm in my pocket, as though holding its own small ember of life. I knelt before the cross and laid it gently at the base, next to the place where the ground had been disturbed. "You've waited long enough," I whispered. "She knows somehow." For a moment, nothing moved. Then a breeze slipped through the aspens, shaking the raindrops from their leaves in a sound that might have been applause or a sigh. I stayed there until the fog thinned and the first patch of blue opened above the ridge. When I finally stood, the woods no longer felt haunted. They just felt complete. On the hike back, I followed the same faint trail of cairns and marks through the trees. The plate on the tree glimmered wetly as I passed it. "Keep looking east." And I realised those words weren't just meant for Lydia. They were for anyone who came after, anyone still searching for something half buried and unfinished. When I reached camp, The fire pit I'd dug was half filled with rainwater, the soil smooth again, as though it had never been disturbed. I broke camp quietly, leaving no trace, and before shouldering my pack, I took one last look toward the valley. The mist was lifting, revealing the line of the river winding like silver thread through the forest. Somewhere down there lay the story of two people who had carved out a small world together, one that the wilderness had swallowed, yet never quite forgotten. As I started back toward the trailhead, I felt a calm settle in my chest. The mystery wasn't solved in any final dramatic way. There was no treasure, no journal ending in revelation. Just the simple, enduring truth of a man who had loved someone enough to leave pieces of himself scattered across the landscape, trusting that someday someone would care enough to listen. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun had broken fully through the clouds. The pines shimmered in that clear after-storm light, and the air smelled of resin and wet earth. I paused once more and looked east toward the place where the valley opened into sky. Somewhere in that wide silence, I thought I heard a voice, faint but certain, say, "Thank you." And I whispered back, "Rest easy, E.M. Whitaker. I'll keep looking east."